well water. And so good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Purple Couch here at the University of Northern Iowa. My name is Jamie Butler-Chidozie, and I will be your facilitator again for today's session. I am super excited about the Purple Couch conversation that we are going to have tonight. We have two very special guests that I will ask to introduce themselves in just a moment. I first want to remind those of you who are viewing right now online the purpose of our Purple Couch. So these are set to have serious conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion. We want to be very intentional about our conversations, understanding that sometimes we have to uncover the ugly to get towards the beauty of what equity is for our institution. And so it makes me think of this quote that just says, courage doesn't mean you don't get afraid. Courage means that you don't let fear stop you. So here, what we really want to set forth for our institution is that sometimes these conversations can be uncertain, they can be challenging, but at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're not overcome by fear, that we continue to press ourselves, we continue to be critical in our analysis of our institution, and ask ourselves the tough questions. So that is what Purple Couch is about. So right now, our topic for tonight's series is student activism. So we have two wonderful panelists at this time. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. Take just a few minutes, introduce yourselves. And if you could think about this initial question that I ask of all of our Purple Couch panelists, share your vision for the University of Northern Iowa or even the community in regards to equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Jamie. Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Jimenez. I use she, her, hers pronouns. To answer your question, I think my vision for the university is to be someone to be a force, not even just at university level, but just in general, who is actively striving to reach equality, inclusion, and equity in regards to how students, faculty, and staff feel on campus. I would love to talk about what a more long-term solution would be like, but for the beginning stage, I think anybody who is doing some actionable work instead of just saying that we believe in these sort of statements.
Hi, I'm Mohammed. Just to answer the question, I would say we can't really talk about transforming the university in isolation without talking about like a societal transformation as a whole. I know in like a lot of the work that we've been doing, we've often run across barriers that come not from like university administration itself, but either like from the Board of Regents or from Iowa law itself. And I think ultimately, in order to reach like diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's going to take a lot of changes, like the power structures of the university. We really need to rethink like who makes decisions at the university level. And it's also going to come through just changes in like the material institutions that exist. But I think ultimately to reach that stage, what it'll take is a lot of questioning of like the ideological tenets or like presuppositions that currently like enframe the university and also just in society in general.
Thank you both. Thank you both. And we're going to delve deeper into some of those ideas and some of those thoughts as we move forward in our conversation. So tonight's conversation, if you haven't figured it out yet, is about student activism on college campuses. And so just thinking about student activism from a historical standpoint, young adults have been at the forefront of some of the most impactful movements in our society to get to that change, Mohammed, that you were talking about, that those societal shifts. So that's what this conversation is about. Now, those movements are not absent from its own criticism. So we want to talk about some of that and possibly hear your perspective on some of those things from our own institution, what it means to be a student and an activist, to delve into what impacts does student activists, actually have on our organizations. And so I'm hoping that we continue to gain just some perspectives through asking and answering some of these challenging questions. So let's get right to it. So both of you are members of an organization called REC. So can you talk about REC from a historical and contemporary perspective? What is your purpose? What does it stand for? And how did we get here in that regard? So both of you can answer, one of you can answer. I'll just put it out there like that.
Sure, I guess I'll start with a little bit more historical basis. REC, which stands for Racial and Ethnic Coalition, began about two and a half years ago, started primarily with the Waka Flocka incident we had here on campus, with the anger that a lot of students felt and community members felt after we had Waka Flocka, the artist, be coming to campus and feeling that the situation was not handled well by administration, by some students also, and the anger that really arose from students and like watching that all be put together. We eventually were able to have Waka Flocka be on campus, not just at some area that is out of the way, but here on Marker Union. And from there, what happened was a lot of students from different historically marginalized identities, from different organizations got together, and we realized that we have a lot of problems here at the university level that we really needed to tackle. We got together, we had a list of situations that we saw on campus. Then we had a multicultural town hall. We brought together students. We gathered a list of short-term demands, long-term demands, and then we presented that to administration. We tried to work with them in effect to be, presenting these issues that we saw as students. We gave them an ample amount of time. We talked with them, we discussed with them to see if these were plans that they felt could be addressed. It was agreed upon that that was a situation that could happen. When we came back after, I believe, summer break, there was not a lot of change done, so we had to go a little bit more on the attack phase. And we ran a lot of social media campaigns. We had a day where we posted a lot of posters outside. We distributed buttons. We got the support of a lot of faculty administration. We actually did another town hall, which we were really surprised and really grateful for the amount of support we reached there. We actually had to start about almost 30 minutes late because we didn't have the good amount of seating. We had to have overflow seating from not only students, but faculty and staff and administration, or not administration, but community members that were able to show up and wanting to have some sort of a change on campus and be able to support us in our efforts. And through that, we've been steadily meeting for the past, like I said, two or so years, and I'll pass it on to Mohammed to talk about some of the change that we've had there on a structural level and what we're kind of hoping for, some of our missions and values.
Okay.
Yeah, and like we've had conversations more recently about changing the name, given that it really did like start out of the like Waka Flocka Flame incident, and so Racial and Ethnic Coalition perhaps made sense at the time, given that we were primarily focusing on issues surrounding the marginalization of racial minorities, but in terms of like having those town halls, developing those long-term goals, like obviously none of these issues exist in isolation, and so trying to broaden that out to like other marginalized communities, and also like trying to develop like a more holistic vision of what like a more egalitarian society would look like. Right now, we're trying to work on formulating some more long-term goals. I know, like, given everything that's happened this year in terms of like the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter protests, like with the killings of like George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others, we've tried to refocus a little bit on issues of like the police on campus, for example, which like the first Purple Couch session touched on, and like prison labor on campus as well. and tried to like incorporate those once again like into a more like holistic vision of what a campus that actually like reflects like student needs would look like. Obviously not only student needs, but given like administration's hold on like institutions as they currently exist, I do think that like the student voice is something that's really missing in terms of like how decisions get made, but also like staff and faculty as well. Just trying to make sure that we are making decisions in a manner where everyone who's going to be impacted by those decisions is able to partake in that.
You two bring up really good points, and I've been jotting notes as you all have been talking, and I definitely want to get to some of this, and I feel like as we go throughout this conversation, we'll definitely hit upon a lot of this more in depth. So Laura, for example, you kind of touched on like processes, which kind of bled into Muhammad, where you were saying like even the need to kind of be flexible, to kind of go back to the drawing board, to self-assess, even as I don't want to say a student organization, because I know that you all want to shy away from the student organization label, but I would love to hear more about kind of the shift that REC might be undergoing. I kind of had heard like just some rumors of a name change, but you two have kind of confirmed those things. How do you, so how has your view of student activism changed throughout this process, and what does that mean for the purpose of the organization, whatever it may be named? I'll just keep referring to it as REC for right now, but how has it changed, if it's changed at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, kind of just reiterate what you were saying, that adaptability is very important, and obviously you're never going to know like what like the national or even international situation is going to be, and so obviously reacting to that is very important. I think like the discourse like surrounding Black Lives Matter more recently has really started like especially with like abolish the police or defund the police, and like prison abolition as well, which, you know, even something like prison abolition was like formulated by Angela Davis like as far back as the 1970s, but we're kind of like just now starting to see that being taken up and being like part of the mainstream discourse. So obviously like being able to adapt to that and sort of to bring that into the fold, so to speak, I think is important. And I guess like to your question about student activism, like once again, like the campus might be a microcosm of like issues that are taking place on the national or international level, but once again, like it's never isolated from anything else that's going on.
Okay, so let's get into some critical conversations. And I think that is a good leadway into some of these more challenging conversations, which is what the Purple Couch is all about, kind of tackling those issues. As I had kind of stated earlier, that there's critics of any and every type of movement. And those critics have very valid points. So it's not to dismiss what any thoughts or how people might be interpreting things. And so I do want to pose some questions just to get us to talk about some of those more critical, challenging type conversations. So there are some students, even from minoritized backgrounds, who believe that REC doesn't necessarily represent them. And I know we've had some individual conversations about this in the past. We saw that particularly with the email campaign that happened. I think it was over early, like summer and the beginning of the semester. So can you speak directly to that and to those students who may feel that way, who might be looking at this on the YouTube page or the Facebook live stream, or even after? can you kind of speak to that audience of students who may feel like they're not represented?
Yeah, I think part of the reason that we try to have town halls that are open to everyone is so that we can collect feedback from the entire campus community, not only like students and staff and faculty, but also members of the community as well. And like I know this time around, in terms of developing our long-term goals, we're trying to do that like within our general body meetings so that we can collect feedback from everyone. But I think maybe like to go to the heart of your question a little bit more in terms of people not feeling represented. I think like the very point of activism is to sort of like push the envelope, so to speak, and like if you just look back to any sort of like social justice movement, like the civil rights movement, these might not have necessarily started off as extremely popular movements. I know like from our perspective today, we can look back at figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and it can be like generally agreed upon that they were good figures, but at the time that they were fighting for these things, like Martin Luther King Jr. was an incredibly controversial figure, incredibly polarizing, especially later when he came out against the Vietnam War. And you know, even in his like letter from Birmingham jail, we can see that reflected in his you know, critique of white moderates, so to speak. And so I think as activists, the goal has to be to like shift the like ideological discourse in such a way, because like the political arena like is always in flux. Like it's not that people have certain ideas that might be reflections of like power structures and like the ideologies that they emanate, but that doesn't mean that like our work is not aiming at like some sort of objective good, and it's just a matter of like critiquing those notions that people might have, and I think it's through the work that we like retroactively achieve that status, like through the civil rights movement. They could only do that work even if it was unpopular, so that we could reach the stage where we can look back on it and like almost like unanimously agree that it was a good thing. And I don't think pushback from certain elements like at that time meant that they shouldn't have done what they did. And that's not to mean that like we would just dismiss any criticism. Obviously, you need to like take it into account, and like you were saying, like self-critiquing as well, I think is very important. But I don't think that like any pushback of any sort necessarily means that what you're doing is wrong.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to this, especially from a student perspective, the idea that just because we share a similar identity that means that we share a monolithic experience at the university level or even just on a basic level is very untrue. And we saw that in the election, especially so, viewing why does this certain demographic vote this way when we expected them to vote this way. We all have different experiences. We all may share some similar situations, but at the end of the day, just because we do share this doesn't mean we all think alike, and we may not all either think in the best way for our own identities, as counterproductive as that may seem. But as Mohammed mentioned earlier, even though we've been doing this for 2.5 years now, we are adapting. It is important for us to adapt. We heard those. We wish, if anybody has any concerns, to definitely come to us. We instated a newsletter function. Within that, we have a form that's anonymous, so that if anybody has any concerns, any questions, something they just don't totally feel comfortable, or anything coming up to us, they can do that, and then we can then address it through our social media. We are trying to be more proactive through our social media. Additionally, this movement was mostly just between our core group members, and now for a variety of reasons, we are trying to open it up, as Mohammed mentioned, with the general body members. Having that every Monday. Anybody who wants to attend just has to let us know so they can get the Zoom link, just so we can get a larger amount of experiences of people, and we've had some great conversations through that, and I hope that's been something that is able to let people feel like they can really give their experiences and have their voices be heard if they haven't felt that before, because that's the last thing we'd really want.
Yeah, and I think also it kind of speaks to how to galvanize particularly here for you and I, the student body, like how to galvanize particularly those from marginalized backgrounds around a particular purpose. That it is important that they see themselves in that purpose and be reflected in that. And so it kind of speaks to like processes. So I know that you had mentioned a lot about the general body meetings that happened every Monday. And towards the end of this conversation, I'll have you both kind of reiterate how students might be able to get involved in activism, but even thinking about, and then we'll kind of end with our thoughts on activism, because even that can feel intimidating to a certain degree. There might be students out there, or even faculty and staff, or even administrators who say, I'm not an activist, I don't know what that means. And so we kind of want to have a conversation around that, but I don't want to get ahead of myself right now. But kind of thinking about processes in regards, so like at the last Purple Couch, for example, I spoke with President Nook and Chief Hare, police chief for the UNI police, about the student demands and the assessment that the police department underwent. The purpose of that was kind of to answer those student demands that you all authored, right? Is that correct? Kind of like those demands that you are all authored. And so I want to delve into two parts of that. The first part is the process part, and then kind of what those demands were. Because we did not get a chance to talk about that at our last Purple Couch. So what those demands were, but even thinking about the processes of that to how are you ensuring that the demands are the demands of the student. And I think, Muhammad, you kind of started it, the demands of the student and not necessarily insular to the 14 or 15 members who are heavily active with REC. Does that make sense? Like, or should we break that question up a little bit?
Maybe break it down a tiny bit.
Okay, let's break it down. No. This is good. This is how courageous conversations happen. So let's break it down. So let's first talk about the actual demands. Mm-hmm. So what were the students looking for the institution, particularly the police department, in that process?
Yeah, so like once again, in terms of getting feedback, just from the campus community in general, there were a number of like testimonial accounts of issues in terms of like racial discrimination and the UNI police specifically. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that we looked at was disarming campus police, because obviously when you're in an incident like that where you are being racially targeted by a police officer, like things can escalate, and it doesn't really seem, especially for most of what UNI police deal with, it doesn't always seem necessary to have a weapon. And I know Laura has been working on, in terms of like wellness checks or in responding to people who like might be dealing with mental health problems. Do we really want someone who's armed, or do we really need someone who is armed to be responding to that, which can like in many cases like worsen the situation. And we also learned that campus police actually didn't have arms, and they only recent decades. And so this is like also like a relatively new phenomenon. And so one of the major demands was around sort of rethinking the necessity for that. Another thing we noticed that's kind of related is that UNI sources a lot of its furniture from prison labor. And apparently there is a section of Iowa code that says that the Regent institutions need to do this legally. And that also seems incredibly unnecessary, given the fact that these are people that are incarcerated. They're often working for like pennies an hour. And obviously in the Constitution, it says slavery is abolished except in the case of incarceration. And so it isn't us saying that prison labor is slavery. It's literally what the Constitution says, that prison labor is slavery. And so I just don't think in 2020 we need to be, like UNI as an institution needs to be funding like Iowa prison industries. And so those were some of the like major tenets of what we were going for.
Okay, and so I think that's good information for people to know, because when you don't know, I like to say, like, you know, the biggest hindrance to having conversations or even progressing, I'll even move beyond in order for us to get to the actionable things in regards to progressing equity, diversity, and inclusion, is to kind of uncover what it is. We have to uncover what areas that we're lacking, where we feel, I often use the analogy of, like, you know, areas that we're sick. Like, we can't get the medicine or we can't get treatment if we're unable to diagnose kind of what our issues are. And so that's what a lot of this is about. And so you as students have kind of taken on the mantle, and I do call it a mantle, to begin to have conversations, or at least, and even more so, call for a certain level of accountability of our institution as it directly relates to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and the impact that that has on the lived experience of students. So I wanted you all to speak to that, one, so that not only administrators, faculty, and staff can kind of hear the student perspective, but that other students can also hear about that student perspective, and even be critical and challenging of themselves as they go throughout their day-to-day lived lives here on campus. So you kind of got to the second part of the question, which was talking about processes. So I'll just kind of do an overview, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong. So it sounds like, and let me just pause and say that you two are student leaders on campus. So you're very visible and very active, even outside of the student activism realm. So that offers an opportunity for accessibility in regards to hearing from students anyway. So we need to just put that out there now too. So it's not too difficult for you to kind of hear, or for students to feel comfortable with kind of sharing their experiences. So my understanding is that you heard from students about particularly their experiences as it relates to what was happening in regards to policing. And so that's where some of the demands were, that's where many of the demands were formed out of these anecdotal type conversations that you were having with peers. I think that's good to know in regards to processing, and kind of speaks to what I was referring to before, being critical in making sure that we are not co-opting people's experiences or elevating something that the community doesn't need. You get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You get what I'm saying in that regard. So we're going to go to another challenging type conversation in question. So critics, I'll just use the term critics. I know I try to use terms that, but you know what, never mind. Y'all know me, y'all know how I get. So critics, I will say critics of student activism, of REC, I will say, say that you all tend to take an all or nothing approach. An all or nothing approach to activism. You ask for 8 things, and if 5 things is presented, it's just not good enough. It's not gonna work. We don't want to hear it. No. You get where I'm going with this? Okay. And so some feel, on all sides, feel that approach doesn't leave room for collaboration, or in some cases halters continued conversation. How do you balance the desire to really see systematic change and impact, and the need to see action, with patience, collaboration, and intentionality?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned here is very important when you say systematic, because this is not just an issue that we may have and it started this year, and this is a one-off situation. Like, this is a historical, these have been issues for quite a long time. They did not come from nowhere. And I think it's very telling when somebody has been harmed for such a long time, to expect them to want to be patient about it, to be patient, to ask for to be treated with dignity. I think it's very telling to do so. For some people, it might be easier, and definitely when you are within a structure that you suddenly realize that you have certain privileges that others don't, it can make you very uncomfortable. And to have those uncomfortable conversations is really important, but a lot of people do not want to be uncomfortable. That's fair. Mm-hmm. Most people don't really want to be uncomfortable. But I also think it can be, and we, within REC themselves, we had different conversations about this. I know a lot of times I was like, are we sure about this? And everyone would be like, yeah, what are you talking about? And I was like, yeah, you're right. Because I doubted some things. And it was like, why, it's almost like, why should we be grateful that you gave us some things when here are all these things that we're asking? When we put in the work to research everything and everything like this, and then we met with you and we agreed if this was a doable situation, and then you only did half or you only did 2 of these things, it is very obvious on how the respect lies in that situation. And we understand that administration and all these different roles have positions that they do on an otherwise basis, but if the university is to truly prize diversity and equity, then they must show it in the respect that they give to people who are showing them when there are issues at hand.
Yeah, and I think just to speak to like this sort of like division between like a more reformist approach versus a more radical approach, and then to also tie it back into like one of your earlier questions, in regards to the report that the police came out with, the UNI police, that is, that looked at their policies and then compared that to the 8 Can't Wait. That was a program that was put out by, I think we can say now, just a grifter, someone who, like, when Black Lives Matter first emerged in 2014, it emerged as a leaderless movement, and that sort of like created a void in which people could, unfortunately, like pretend to speak for people that they didn't. And so no one, from at least what I'm aware, there were no like student activists on campus that were specifically asking for the 8 Can't Wait to be implemented with the UNI police. And I think it is, like if you actually look through some of the tenets of it, like chokehold bans, which chokehold bans are implemented and often chokeholds still happen. And then ultimately what happened with the report, which they compared it to a policy set that no one asked them to compare it to, and which I don't think represents what people actually want on campus. All they said is, we already do most of these things, and the ones that weren't like codified in policy, we still didn't do them, and so we just decided to codify them. And so when you take this like reformist approach, like ultimately nothing happens, because ultimately nothing did happen. They just said, we already do all of these things. And so you're really not going to see any sort of change occur if you're going to take this stance. And it really does require, like I said, like pushing the envelope more in order to see like the changes that we need. And I think, like as Laura was saying, like just from our previous dealings with administration, we know that they're like intransigent to our demands. And like when we formulated the short-term demands, they were incredibly tepid, to be honest. They didn't really like challenge any sort of like power structure. It was just things that they could have easily implemented, and they said they were going to, and then they just didn't. And like was already mentioned, like the respect component, like we didn't take a more hostile approach to administration until they completely like disrespected us and dismissed us as student activists. And I think that was sort of when we realized that that more lenient approach wasn't going to work.
And I think I want to. I don't want to change up the conversation, but I want to delve deeper into some of the things that you actually brought up, into thinking about. I know you said like nothing's happened. I would push against that a little bit. I would push against that, because I feel like even with the back and forth, the challenges that were back and forth between reg and administration, that there actually has been some things that have happened, and that you have had an impact here at UNI. I get what you're saying in regards to the definite, this is what we want, this is what we need, and the action behind it, the action behind some of those needs. But there has been impact here at UNI. Can you speak to that? How do you feel like you as student activists have impacted this campus?
Well, what I think we've seen a lot is we are now seeing a lot of different committees suddenly being made in regards, and whether this is because of the work that REC did on campus or because of just current events that have been happening. A lot of different departments, a lot of different offices are suddenly looking a lot more into DEI work. We know the council, of course, the President's Council that you chair and I sit on as Director of Diversity, is doing substantial work there. But another thing, and while it has been really cool to see the work, and to when someone tells us, and it's like you said here, like that we've done change, sometimes it's kind of shocking to me, because like, well, we were just trying to do something, and it's very cool to hear that. But a thing that I worry about is when it comes especially to making these committees and doing this, is that people are then, they're like, oh, okay, great, we made a committee, now we're good to go. And I almost see that a little bit, because we were able to really rile up people and to want to do action, and then suddenly we have an announcement that things are being done, and while maybe you and I are doing work in the council, it feels like, and this is also because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and quite a lot of things are happening, it allows people to almost feel and think that, okay, well, we've done the work is over now. And that's the last thing that we would want. So while I think it has pushed people, I hope that this is not the end push. I hope that it continues to roll people forward, to roll institutions forward into not being lenient, into further action.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I don't want to. I'll come back to my thought on that. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and kind of just to reiterate what was already said. Unfortunately, it seems like the committee is kind of a way to just shift responsibility, because I just rewatched the first Purple Couch session, and when you ask Nook, like, what has actually changed, and he just said, like, this committee is formed and they're working on things, and so that means that there's nothing that administration needs to do now. Now it's up to the committee to do all the work. And also just to clarify what I meant in terms of nothing, I meant specifically in terms of, like, if you're going to ask for the 8 can't wait reforms, then nothing will change, because they'll put out a report and it will just say, oh, we already do all of these things. So yeah, and so just to answer your question in terms of maybe like the impact that REC has had on campus, I would say really at this stage it's mostly just been trying to shift the ideological discourse, and that's not really something that we're doing so much as something that's happening like on the international stage that is simply like reflected back like into the campus, you know.
And I'm gonna put my notes down, because we get ready to go to, you know, like I'll come back to them if necessary. But I think it's also important to kind of know, you know, in having this conversation too, is that this work doesn't progress if it's not actualized and materialized throughout our organization. And so, so now I'm kind of shifting. I'm putting on like another hat, like as chair of the advisory council, is that a sure way to push an organization to critical resistance is to unveil. You got to take that. You got to take that cover off of whatever. You got to take that Band-Aid off of that wound and uncover the infection. And so one of the ways, and you all can, again, feel free to challenge me, because that's what we're modeling here. Feel free to challenge me. One of the takeaways I feel that student activism is most powerful, other than giving voice to voiceless, is uncovering that wound, that infection, to say, there's hurt here, and it needs to there needs to be some mitigation of whatever this hurt is. And so what I am seeing is that now, which I do believe is a shift for this particular institution, is that we are entering a place where we are I'll say me, I'll speak for myself because I don't want to put words in your mouth, are unafraid to say we have a problem here. We have a problem here, and there is a way by which we can start to mitigate some of these things. And so, so in regards to like the work like of the advisory council, it's honestly modeling the approach of student activism. If you really kind of want me to be just very frank and honest, it's actually saying, here is the data, here's what we've gathered, whether it's anecdotally, whether it's your ability or inability to produce the information, because that in and of itself makes a particular statement in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And here is how we see as a community, you need to fix it. So that it's actually not the work, look, now I'm getting all hyped, that it doesn't become the work of an insular group or an organization to bear the burden or have the onus of trying to mitigate this systematic catastrophe that has happened and that we live through. And it's particularly important for individuals with minoritized identities, because a lot of times we feel that burden. Oftentimes we feel obligated to do the work, but a secondary piece is that we feel the burden because we identify with the minoritized identity as well. So we have to do both ends. Like we have to be the superhero and then cry in private kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so I do believe, Muhammad, it is pushing us to what is critical resistance here at UNI. What is it going to take for it not to be solely a committee, as Laura was saying? How do we make sure that when you graduate, REC also, or whatever, however you term it, whatever you rename it, doesn't graduate with you? Because if that happens, that also is a disservice, not just to the student body, but to the betterment of our institution. And so what are ways in which we can be thinking about it from that approach, that critical resistance approach of it not falling to just, it's the committee's work, but no, it is the president's work, it is the provost's work, it is the faculty's work, it is the community work, it is the work of from the custodian on through, on out. How do we do that?
Yeah, I think when the president first established this idea of forming a committee, something that was really important to REC was trying to push for this committee to actually have some sort of autonomy and some sort of power, and actually being able to institute the action items that they came up with. And we met with senior leadership. We developed a counter proposal in terms of how the committee should be structured, and providing it that like power and autonomy to actually make changes on campus. And senior leadership completely disregarded our entire proposal and instead decided to make the committee like a suggestive body where it provides suggestions to the president, who still like retains ultimate authority over whether those action items are actually going to be implemented or not. And so in terms of actually being able to change a lot of these problems that we were talking about, it's going to require the development of like parallel power structures, short of actually changing the very nature of the institution itself. And I think the committee can still act as that focal point in terms of like galvanizing people around issues, even if the president refuses to take up those action items that are suggested to him. But like building lasting institutions that can sort of challenge the way the university currently operates, I think will be fundamental to keep up like the work that we've hopefully started.
Yeah, absolutely. When we get to talking about power structures, I think that's very instrumental in talking about this issue at hand. We see, as you mentioned, students and faculty and staff who come from historically marginal identities are forced and for various reasons commit certain actions that will have to do work that their counterparts do not have to do work. So while our peers who do not have historically marginalized identities can continue to act just as students, just as people their age, we are not able to do so.
Yeah.
And whether and I think that was also, as you look at student organizations, actual student organizations, you see a lot of them be putting on great events, they put a great effort into this, and one of the big issues at hand there is that then what happens is that our fellow peers do not show up. An administration does not show up. There is no, and then what happens there, if there is a good event, like say maybe BSU has a fantastic skating event, which they have, and then what happens there is the university then says, look, we made this event possible, when it is the work of students of color who did that. The work that happens on campus is often done by historically marginalized identities and people who hold those identities. And when we have those in positions of power, they often fail to recognize that they have power, or they say like, this is horrible, somebody should do something. It's like, yes, somebody should do something. It's cool that you said that because you can do something about this.
Right.
Yeah, and I found I was very surprised oftentimes because as you mentioned, it's kind of almost easier to talk about these issues now. And as we said this, I heard a lot of like shock. I heard a lot of like, I cannot believe, I'm so sorry this happened, and I was like, I can't believe this is the first time you've heard about this. Like, this is a common experience for me, all my friends, we talk about it, this is no secret. So the fact that this is the first time you've heard about it, it tells me a lot about who you're listening to, what you're paying attention to, what you're devoting yourself to. So I think it's often we put a lot of onus of responsibility on people doing activism work, but everyone has to take some sort of an action, like you're saying, and especially before taking away or changing power structures is going to take some time. So while we still have the ones we have, people who are using or having that power should be doing so much more than they currently do. And I think it's very interesting. We see people who are asking like, well, what do I do now? How do I do this? Look around you. There's a lot of opportunities to do so. It shouldn't be that hard to figure it out. And even if you're finding it difficult, there is always going to be somebody saying there's an issue. And if you're not seeing it, you're probably overlooking it.
And that's why I hope we began to change the narrative, that we began to talk about this systematic oppression, systematic racism, whatever the ism is, as systems of advantage, because then that flips and turns the onus on dominant identities to then respond to, I'm actually being privileged by this system of advantage versus this system of disadvantage. And in that process, that it's the work of individuals to then hold that system accountable for them doing the work. I don't know if that makes sense, for them doing the work. So it is my hope and my approach is that we move away again from the suggestive kind of tactic to this is what you should do. It opens up the door. So when it says, I have no clue what to do. Hey, how about this? That we begin to have that, but we do it in a way in which, again, uncovers. So it's one thing for REC to be invited to a senior leadership meeting to discuss the experiences of lit students and even to hear solutions. It's another thing for that to happen, because that is a very important piece. Because if you don't have decision makers to the table, how can you begin to have conversations about how to create parallel opportunities of power or parallel structures to kind of aid us in progressing this work. We got to have the people at the table in order to do that, right? And so, but what is it like to utilize I'm not trying to be careful with my words, but I am trying to make sure that I accurately say what I want to say. How do we use, for example, the President's Advisory Council for Inclusion, Transformative, and Social Justice to get some of that, to leverage, to get some of that work done so that we can begin to move this organization? Because I hope is your hope that the reason why you're doing it is that you want this institution to be equitable. Is that you want students who are coming to you and I to experience something where they're thriving here, and maybe even having a better experience than you. And so I hope that continues. Now I'm being selfish in that part, and that ask is that we continue to push, to challenge, to be transformative, to hold the institution responsible. So, and I'm even kind of talking myself up to say it's okay to step out there. It's okay to take a risk. It's okay to come back to the table, to begin to continue to push. Laura, I want to touch on something that you brought up, that you can't just be a student. You're not just the average student here. There's this other complexity, there's this other part that you have to play in regards to your role here as students, and particularly as student activists on campus, but not just student activists, because any student can be a student activist, but identifying with the marginalized identity is kind of a third part to that. How are you doing with that?
I don't think it's an easy task to do so. We talk a lot, especially in regarding to college students. It is already such a stressful environment. The mental health of students is a huge priority for colleges all around the nation, all around the world, really. To add on to that, we talk about issues like racial trauma, and to just on an activism, but to get together as a group. People have different opinions on things. You have to get schedules together, different issues like that. I remember on some of our more earlier stages, and we were really struggling. Obviously, this is something that is very important to us, but things get frustrating when things don't move as quick as maybe you wanted. Things don't, they don't go as you hope it do, because often with activism, it's never going to be an easy journey. And what I remember is we actually brought you in to ask some questions like, Jamie, how do we deal with this? Yeah. And you let us know that when we were making these bonds, we were doing it in the structure of trauma, the structure of racism. Yeah. And it was important that we delve out of that. And I think that is incredibly important, and especially as we talk about community. As students who have marginalized backgrounds, it is incredibly important for us to find community in the rest of our peers, in each other as groups. And that has been really instrumental in being able to help us do anything, really. I know when we came up, when students from REC worked on the proposal, the CSSJ proposal, we stayed up for 2 weeks, for so much. I know probably most of our grades suffered, so we could write this 40 so page document to present or something. When we did our campaigns, we would stay up super late. Our meetings run longer than 2 hours some days. Yeah. It's no easy task, for sure. It definitely takes a toll on somebody. Yeah, I think it'd be remiss to say that it didn't.
Yeah, and I would just say, going back to your comment about the community being formed around trauma and oppression and moving away from that, I would just say I think it's also important to try to hold the space open for that vision, and to try to I know obviously you have to focus on the issues at hand that you want to resolve. But it's also about forming a community around that alternative vision of what you want the future to be like.
So what do you do for self-care?
In general, or personally?
Either one.
I just do like a lot of gardening.
Like how do you, when you're in those moments, how do you continue? Like, how do you continue to go to class? How do you continue with the group work? How do you say, you know, I'm a student, like I need to be a student? How do you get through it?
We had some members who had to step away from the organization to focus, because we did recognize that while this was very important, we were students, and having to completely understand, and we totally understood when someone is like, hey, I need to take a break from this. We're like, absolutely, make sure to take care of yourself first and foremost. Even just confiding within each other, being like, hey, I'm really struggling with this, I'm taking time to do so. Even just meeting at separate times to discuss certain things, having maybe toward the end of our meetings we would talk about things. We would really stress open communication, because like as we mentioned, frustrations really bubbled over sometimes. What it meant for us to be open with each other, being like, hey, what you said here I really didn't like, I didn't agree with this.
Yeah.
And that was really important for us to recognize each other as a team, and to be able to communicate with each other. And sometimes it was just when we had a win, we would take that opportunity, be like, you know, congratulate each other, be like, look, we were able to do this. We finally got a W here, you know? Yeah. Really being able to take those moments and treasure them and see what everybody else is doing.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of the way to like relate to the work, I think what's helpful for me is sort of finding yourself within a historical trajectory, if that makes sense. Like the fact that there are so many people who like over the centuries like fought and died for like some of the work that we're doing. Yeah. And then to see that continuity, and then once again going back to the thing about like maintaining that vision of a future. I think just finding yourself like within that historical continuity is really important. And I also like the way I view the work is as a necessity. Like I don't view it as like a voluntary decision that I made that I can then like rescind at any moment.
Yeah.
It's more of a like finding the conditions of the world as it exists now so intolerable that that there is nothing else to do.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. And it kind of it leads us kind of right to, I know we're coming to our time here, but it kind of lends itself to kind of how I wanted to end this conversation. That with activism is I kind of set it at the forefront. Really kind of wanted us, the whole point of Purple Couch is for different perspectives to come, to have a conversation, but also to be challenged, to think about our role in all of this work. And that activism serves as an invitation for any and everyone to engage in promoting that systematic change, in promoting that movement. I mean that improvement. And what was the word you used? Did you say horrendous, or did I just make that up? It was something along the lines of that you find it so deplorable. Intolerable. Yes. Thank you. Intolerable that it moves you to action. It moves you to facilitation. It moves you to think beyond to move beyond yourself. And I think it's important to know, like, you know, for students here, you and I, for administrators here, for faculty and staff to understand that this process of engaging, particularly students in activism, is important. And it's not nice. Like, you know, there might be administrators and faculty who are looking at this live and saying, I told you, you know, that's a part of it. And you might be feeling like, see, here we go again. But that's part of it. It's because I actually had on here, and thank you, Muhammad, for bringing it out, it's honoring the history behind it. we didn't get here overnight, and so we know that it's not going to take overnight, even in the impatience, even with the sense of urgency, and even with these lived experiences. We understand that, but that we also, again, put ourselves in positions, all of us, but particularly if dominant identities, putting yourselves in positions of humility, to understand this is not about me. That nations are calling on you to advocate. Nations of people are calling on you, are inviting you with open arms to engage in this fight. And so I want you to feel supported. I do. I want you, and I understand where you're at. But I also understand the importance of student activism and hoping and inviting students. Here at UNI, I have to wrap up, inviting students to engage with this, understanding not just based upon the obligation or that, but that, even research show that student activism builds self-efficacy, that is actually it's developmentally appropriate, that is inclusive, that provides that space and that place for us to pay what we owe. Alice Walker has this famous quote, and I'll just end it right here because they're giving me the wrap-up sign, is that activism is the rent that I pay for living on this planet. And what I always say at the end of that, rent is due. It is due and it is late. So thank you to our students for joining us. And actually our next segment is actually of Purple Couch will be with members of the Advisory Council. So we'll get to ask some tough questions of our members who serve on that board. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.